Do you remember those cheap farmhouse meals that never made it into glossy cookbooks? The kind of dishes built from garden scraps, pantry staples, and a whole lot of resourcefulness. In the 1970s, poor farmers weren't cooking for trends or presentation. They were cooking to survive, to stretch, to make something out of almost nothing. Today, we're revisiting 30 of those humble but unforgettable dishes that fed families and shaped memories. Fried cornmeal mush. If you've ever opened the pantry and stared at a nearly bare shelf, wondering what on earth could be made from scraps, you'd have gotten along just fine with farm families of the 1970s. One of their secret champions was fried cornmeal mush, a dish as plain as its name but rich in purpose. It began with the most unassuming of ingredients: cornmeal, water, or milk, and a little salt. Stirred on the stove until thick enough to stand a spoon straight up, the mush was poured into a pan, cooled until firm, and then sliced into slabs. From there, the magic happened. Those slices hit a skillet, sizzling until the outside turned golden and crisp, while the inside stayed soft and hearty. Cornmeal mush wasn't glamorous, but it was endlessly versatile. Served with syrup or honey, it was breakfast. Paired with beans or greens, it became dinner. Topped with gravy or even just butter, it was a meal that filled the belly and stretched a penny. For children, it was often a cause for groans, not mush again. But for parents, it was reassurance, a dependable dish that could always be counted on. Its roots stretched back to the Great Depression, when frugality wasn't just a virtue, but survival. By the 1970s, it still lingered in farm kitchens, a reminder of resilience passed down through generations. Today, you'll find its cousin, polenta fries, on chic restaurant menus, dressed up with fancy toppings and price tags to match. The irony would not be lost on those farmers who once relied on the dish simply to get through the week. Fried cornmeal mush stands as proof that even the humblest of foods can leave lasting memories, crisped to perfection in a skillet and served with pride. Pinto beans and cornbread. Few meals speak to the resilience of 1970s farm kitchens quite like a steaming pot of pinto beans served alongside a skillet of golden cornbread. Pinto beans were the perfect staple, cheap, hearty, and packed with protein. They soaked overnight in enamel bowls before simmering for hours on the stove with little more than salt, an onion, or a ham hock if one happened to be around. As the beans softened and thickened into a savory stew, a cast iron skillet of cornbread baked in the oven, its crispy edges giving way to a tender, warm center. Some families sweetened their cornbread. Others swore it was a sin. Either way, the combination made for a meal that stretched across days, repurposed into lunches, stews, or even bean spreads. But beans and cornbread weren't just food. They were rituals. The scent of beans simmering filled the house, a steady reminder that dinner was on its way. Families gathered around tables where this humble pairing provided not just nourishment, but stability. Proof that even in lean times, there was always enough to share. For children, it may have felt repetitive, the same flavors night after night. But looking back, it was constancy, comfort plated daily. Today, beans and cornbread is marketed as rustic Southern comfort food dished up with garnishes and flair. Yet in the 1970s, there was no pretense. It was survival food, crafted with resourcefulness and quiet dignity, a meal that symbolized thrift, community, and the simple joy of something warm waiting at the end of the day. Goulash, ground beef stretch. In the farmhouse kitchens of the 1970s, goulash was never about authenticity or European flair. It was about making a single pound of ground beef stretch as far as possible. A pot of elbow macaroni, a can or two of tomatoes, chopped onion, and perhaps a sprinkle of paprika if someone was feeling ambitious. And suddenly dinner for six was bubbling away on the stove. The ground beef wasn't the centerpiece so much as a supporting role, scattered thinly through the noodles like little treasures. Mothers knew the trick. Brown the beef with plenty of onion and season it well, so no one noticed how little meat was actually in the pot. It wasn't a beautiful dish, reddish, steaming, and ladled into chipped bowls, but it carried a dependable comfort. Children recognized it instantly by the tangy tomato scent drifting through the house, a smell that meant supper was close. Leftovers were often better the next day, the noodles soaking up even more flavor, making it one of those rare meals families didn't mind eating twice. In today's world, American goulash is splashed across food blogs and TikTok as a quick, one-pot wonder, celebrated for its ease. But in the 1970s, it wasn't praised or romanticized. It was a necessity in a pot. It was about feeding a family without apology, a dish of ingenuity laced with love and a determination that no one went to bed hungry. Spam and potatoes skillet. When meat prices in the 1970s stretched further than a farmer's paycheck could handle, Spam stepped in with its unmistakable blue can and promise of sustenance. For many farm families, it wasn't glamorous, but it was reliable, salty, shelf-stable, and versatile. Pairing Spam with potatoes, the true workhorse of the farm kitchen, created a skillet meal that could fuel a day's worth of labor. Cubed potatoes fried in a bit of oil until golden, onions added for depth, and chunks of Spam crisped along the edges made a dish that was as filling as it was frugal. After long days in the fields, no one cared if it was fancy. It was hot, hearty, and waiting at the table. For children, the sound of Spam hitting the skillet meant comfort, the savory aroma drifting through the house signaling that dinner wasn't far. For parents, it meant practicality. Potatoes from the root cellar, Spam from the pantry, and no need to worry about spoilage or fuss. Leftovers, if there were any, reheated easily for breakfast the next morning. Fast forward to today, and Spam has made an unlikely comeback, celebrated in Hawaiian musubi, fried rice bowls, and even gourmet reinterpretations. Social media praises it as quirky, nostalgic, even cool. But back then, Spam and potatoes weren't ironic or indulgent. They survived in a skillet, fried in cast iron and served with quiet pride. It was the taste of thrift turned into sustenance, the kind of dish that filled bellies and reminded families that resourcefulness could always save the day. Egg noodles with butter and onions. Sometimes the best meals are the simplest, and in the 1970s farmhouse kitchen, few dishes embodied that truth more perfectly than egg noodles with butter and onions. There were no complicated sauces or expensive ingredients to be found here, just pantry staples that could be stretched into something warm, filling, and comforting at the end of a long day. Homemade noodles, rolled and cut on floured counters, were common in some homes, while store-bought bags of egg noodles offered a quicker option in others. Either way, the process was straightforward. Boil until tender, toss in melted butter, and stir through a skillet of onions fried until golden and fragrant. Sometimes, if fortune smiled, a little black pepper or even a pinch of paprika was added. but most of the time it was nothing more than butter, onion, and noodles coming together in harmony. This dish was never about impressing anyone. It was about feeding families quickly and cheaply, using what was always on hand. Butter added richness, onions provided depth, and the noodles made it hearty enough to quiet hungry stomachs after a day spent working fields, mending fences, or tending animals. Kids often rolled their eyes at yet another meatless dinner, but those caramelized onions gave the illusion of something indulgent, a clever stand-in for luxuries that weren't in the budget. Parents, meanwhile, appreciated how far a few cents worth of noodles and onions could go, especially when every dollar had to stretch across groceries, gas, and farm expenses. The beauty of egg noodles with butter and onions was its reliability. It could be on the table in 20 minutes. It required no special planning, and it left everyone with full stomachs and warm plates. Leftovers reheated easily in the skillet, often tasting even better when the butter soaked deeper into the noodles. It was, in many ways, the original minimalist meal, cheap, quick, and nourishing. Today, you could imagine this exact dish going viral on TikTok as a 3-ingredient comfort pasta, praised for its simplicity and rustic charm. Food bloggers might dress it up with browned butter, artisanal noodles, and organic onions, but the core remains unchanged. In the 1970s, it was just dinner. Quick, reliable, and nourishing in the way only fat and starch can be. It was proof that sometimes the humblest meals carry the most comfort, binding families together around the table with nothing more than a skillet, a pot, and a little love. Dandelion greens. Salad. Long before foraging became a buzzword on social media, farm families in the 1970s were already experts at pulling supper straight out of the yard. Dandelion green salad was one of those dishes born out of necessity, not novelty. Bitter, earthy, and packed with nutrients no one in those days had the time to measure, it was valued for one simple reason: it kept the family strong. The method was straightforward: gather the youngest leaves, the ones tender enough to chew without feeling like leather, wash away the dirt, and dress them with what was on hand. A splash of vinegar, a pinch of salt, maybe a hard-boiled egg or crumbled bacon if the pantry or smokehouse allowed, and suddenly a bowl of weeds became a meal. Children rarely celebrated its arrival at the table. The sharp bite of dandelion greens was a far cry from the comfort of potatoes or cornbread. And many a child chewed reluctantly while dreaming of something sweeter. But parents knew better. They saw food growing freely in ditches, lawns, and fields, and they recognized it as provision, proof that nature had a way of feeding those willing to bend down and gather. That kind of thrift carried pride, a reminder that resilience often meant seeing abundance where others saw nuisance. This wasn't a dish of luxury, and no one mistook it for one. It was a reflection of the times, a practical, no-cost solution when money was scarce and gardens hadn't yet fully come in. Families might not have raved about the flavor, but they respected its place on the table because it meant no one went hungry. Fast forward to today, and dandelion greens are treated very differently. You'll find them stacked in neat bundles at farmers' markets, commanding prices that would make those 1970s farmers shake their heads in disbelief. Modern chefs label them rustic chic, tossing them into salads alongside goat cheese and toasted nuts, while wellness enthusiasts rebrand them as detox superfoods. But back then, dandelion greens weren't a trend or a health statement. They were survival, a side dish born of necessity and ingenuity. Sometimes supper really did come from the cracks in the sidewalk, and that humble bowl of greens carried with it a story of grit, gratitude, and making do. Lard biscuits with gravy. Few dishes capture the soul of a 1970s farmhouse breakfast better than a plate of lard biscuits smothered in gravy. These biscuits weren't born of luxury. They were built on thrift and practicality. Flour, salt, and a scoop of lard, often rendered from the family hog that had already provided bacon, sausage, and more, were mixed together and baked in a hot oven until the tops crisped and the insides turned soft and flaky. They weren't delicate like the biscuits you find in bakeries today. No, these were sturdy, substantial, built to carry the weight of a ladle full of rich, peppery milk gravy. That gravy was made from the drippings of whatever meat had been fried earlier, or on lean mornings, from nothing more than browned flour whisked with milk to create a sauce that stretched scraps into something hearty. These biscuits and gravy often meant the difference between an empty stomach and enough energy to face a long day of chores in the fields. Families gathered around worn wooden tables, the biscuits split open and drenched in steaming gravy, their warmth filling both bellies and spirits. For children, the repetition of biscuits for breakfast might have felt tiresome, but for parents, it was reliability itself. It was the comfort of knowing there was always something that could be made from what was on hand, always a way to start the day with nourishment, however humble. Fast forward to today, and biscuits and gravy have undergone a transformation. They're the darlings of brunch menus, served in cast iron skillets, topped with fresh herbs, or paired with artisanal sausage. Foodies photograph them, restaurants elevate them, and diners call them comfort food. But back in the 70s, they weren't a trend, and no one thought of them as a nostalgic treat. They were necessary. Simple ingredients, treated with care, transformed into something satisfying. Lard biscuits with gravy stand as a reminder that resilience often tastes best when it's born out of necessity, and that survival, with the right touch, can still feel like a feast. Potato pancakes, leftover mash, reborn. On a 1970s farm, wasting food wasn't just frowned upon. It was unthinkable. Every potato pulled from the earth represented labor, sweat, and sustenance. So letting even a spoonful of mashed potatoes go to waste was practically a sin. That's where potato pancakes came in. A clever and delicious way to give leftovers a second life. Yesterday's mash, often cold and stiff from sitting overnight, was mixed with a handful of flour, an egg if the hens were cooperative, and maybe some chopped onion for a little kick. The mixture was then spooned into a sizzling skillet where it transformed into golden brown cakes with crisp edges and soft, pillowy centers. What could have been scraps destined for the slop bucket instead became a meal worth looking forward to. These pancakes often turned up at breakfast, topped with a fried egg or paired with applesauce, especially if the cellar still held jars from the summer's canning. They could also appear at supper, holding their own next to beans, sausage, or even just a pat of butter. For children, they were a welcome break from plain mashed potatoes, a dish that felt indulgent despite its humble origins. The crisp bite, followed by a soft center, made them fun to eat, proof that leftovers didn't have to mean dullness. For parents, potato pancakes were more than food. They were resourceful on a plate, evidence that nothing went unused, and that thrift could still taste like comfort. Today, you'll find potato pancakes on diner menus and in trendy restaurants, sometimes dressed up as latkes with sour cream and smoked salmon. They're marketed as heritage food, celebrated for their rustic charm. But in the farmhouse kitchens of the 70s, there was no such fanfare. They weren't cultural statements or culinary experiments. They were simple survival fried until golden brown. Each bite carried the unspoken wisdom of a generation that knew how to make every ingredient count. Potato pancakes were, and still are, proof that frugality can be delicious, and that gratitude tastes best when crisped in a skillet and shared at the family table. Macaroni with canned tomatoes. In the farm kitchens of the 1970s, macaroni with canned tomatoes was the epitome of cheap but cheerful. Elbow macaroni was affordable and filled bellies quickly, while a jar or can of tomatoes, often home-canned from the summer garden, gave the dish its tangy backbone. Sometimes onions or a little garlic were tossed in, and if the pantry allowed, a sprinkle of cheese made its way on top. But most often, it was just pasta and tomatoes, simmered together until the noodles soaked up that bright, acidic flavor. This dish wasn't meant to dazzle. It was meant to keep supper simple and costs low. Kids twirled forkfuls around chipped plates, sometimes grumbling about the lack of meat, but still eating heartily. For parents, it was a relief. Dinner made from a few staples that never failed to be on hand. Leftovers reheated well, often turning thicker and richer overnight, which made it doubly practical. Today, the same meal might be rebranded as a rustic pasta pomodoro, garnished with fresh basil and olive oil. But in the 1970s farmhouse, it was straightforward nourishment, proof that even two ingredients could stretch into something warm, filling, and just familiar enough to feel like comfort. Cabbage soup. For farmers in the 1970s, cabbage soup was the kind of meal that rose out of necessity and ingenuity. It was a dish that showed up when times were lean, when gardens were overflowing with hearty vegetables, and when the family table needed filling without draining the wallet. A single head of cabbage could be stretched into multiple meals, its sturdy leaves chopped and simmered with potatoes, carrots, onions, or whatever else the cellar had to offer. Sometimes, the pot held little more than cabbage and salt. Other times, a bone, a scrap of ham, or a bit of bacon grease added depth. Meat was never guaranteed, but that didn't matter. The cabbage itself, humble and hearty, carried the weight of the soup. The ritual of cabbage soup was as much about resilience as it was about sustenance. Families gathered at the end of long days, bowls in hand, steam rising from chipped enamelware, grateful for warmth that cut through the chill of autumn or winter. The smell of cabbage simmering wasn't glamorous. It was pungent, familiar, and deeply tied to survival. Children might wrinkle their noses, pushing chunks of cabbage aside, but parents knew the truth. This was a dish that kept hunger at bay and proved that even the simplest ingredients could sustain. What made cabbage soup remarkable was its adaptability. Every family had their own version, dictated by what was available that season or what was left in the pantry. Sometimes thick and stew-like, other times thin and brothy. It was a meal that bent itself to circumstance. Leftovers only grew richer overnight, the flavors deepening, making it a dependable staple for days at a time. Fast forward to today, and cabbage soup reappears every so often under new disguises. As a miracle weight loss soup, a minimalist cleanse, or a trendy plant-based comfort food. Health gurus praise its low-calorie benefits, and chefs spin it into chic bowls topped with fresh herbs. But for farm families of the 70s, none of that mattered. It wasn't about dieting or detoxing. It was about making sure no one went to bed hungry, no matter how bare the pantry shelves looked. Cabbage soup was and remains a steaming symbol of resilience, frugality, and the quiet strength of a resourceful kitchen. Rice pudding. When cupboards began to look bare in the 1970s, rice pudding was often the sweet, practical answer to the unspoken question: how do you make something out of nothing? Leftover rice, too plain to excite on its own, was transformed with a splash of milk, a spoonful of sugar, and maybe a dash of cinnamon or nutmeg if the spice tin hadn't yet run empty. Some families stirred in raisins for texture, others kept it simple, letting the creamy sweetness of rice and milk carry the dish. Cooked low and slow, whether baked in the oven or simmered gently on the stovetop, the pudding thickened into a dessert that was at once humble and deeply comforting. For farm children, rice pudding often felt like a rare indulgence. Warm, soft, and sweet, it was the sort of dish that made the weariness of school and chores melt away. It wasn't candy, it wasn't cake, but it was sweet enough to count as a treat, and that made it special. Parents, meanwhile, valued it for its thrift. With little more than leftovers and a few pantry staples, they could serve up something that felt like love in a bowl. The smell of cinnamon drifting through the kitchen could transform even an ordinary evening into something memorable, filling the house with warmth that went beyond just heat from the stove. The beauty of rice pudding lies in its adaptability. Leftovers from one night's meal became the next day's dessert, proving that nothing in a farm kitchen had to go to waste. Each family had its own version, passed down through habit more than recipe, altered by what was on hand at the time. Today, rice pudding has been reimagined countless ways, dressed up with caramel sauces, fruit compotes, or exotic spices on restaurant menus. Yet its heart remains unchanged. In the farmhouse kitchens of the 1970s, rice pudding wasn't about extravagance or presentation. It was proof that sweetness could be coaxed out of the simplest ingredients. A small celebration of resourcefulness, and a reminder that love often tasted like cinnamon rising from a humble pot on the stove. Liver and onions. In the farmhouse kitchens of the 1970s, liver and onions was the very definition of a love-hate dish. Parents swore by it, insisting it was good for you, while children pushed it around their plates, praying for a quick escape. Liver was cheap, abundant, and packed with iron and protein, making it one of the few affordable cuts of meat for families keeping a close eye on every penny. Sliced thin, dredged in flour, and fried in a cast iron skillet, the liver took on a rich, hearty flavor, at least for those who enjoyed it. The onions, sautéed until golden and fragrant, weren't just there for taste. They softened the liver's intensity, providing sweetness to balance its bite, and a hopeful disguise for the kids who dreaded each forkful. To adults, liver and onions wasn't a punishment. It was practicality. It represented nourishment, strength, and a sense of responsibility to make sure every part of the animal was used. A farmer who raised livestock couldn't afford to waste anything, and the liver was just another way to stretch meals and build energy for the next day's work. To children, however, it was something else entirely. A trial of willpower, a dish that tested patience and taste buds alike. Yet even in their complaints, those kids absorbed a lesson about thrift and gratitude. The dish carried with it a certain dignity. It wasn't flashy or indulgent, but it reflected the values of the time: resourcefulness, resilience, and the belief that food was fuel before it was pleasure. Fast forward to today, and liver has begun to creep back into modern food culture. Health-conscious eaters prize it for its nutrient density, while chefs in the nose-to-tail movement champion it as a sustainable choice. But in the 1970s, there were no trends attached to liver and onions. It wasn't served to impress or to make a statement. It was served because it was affordable, filling, and, at least according to the parents, good for you. For farm families, a plate of liver and onions was a reminder that nourishment and thrift often walked hand in hand, even if it came with a side of childhood groans. Tomato gravy over biscuits. In the 1970s, when farm families needed to stretch a garden's bounty into something filling, tomato gravy over biscuits was a reliable go-to. Tomatoes, whether fresh from the garden or pulled from mason jars carefully canned the summer before, were the backbone of this dish. Simmered down with flour, bacon grease, or butter, they transformed into a tangy, savory gravy that was ladled generously over biscuits hot from the oven. The biscuits themselves were no nonsense: flour, lard, a pinch of salt, baked until golden. Together, the pairing created a meal that was cheap, hearty, and versatile enough to serve at breakfast, lunch, or supper. If there was sausage or ham in the house, it could be crumbled into the gravy, turning it into a feast. If not, the tomatoes held their own as the star of the plate. This dish was more than just food, it was resilient in edible form. Every bite carried with it the memory of summer gardens, when families worked together to preserve harvest for the leaner months ahead. The tangy brightness of the tomato gravy against the flaky, salty biscuits offered a comfort that came not from extravagance but from reliability. For children, it might not have seemed remarkable at the time, but as adults, many came to recognize it as the taste of home. The memory of steam rising from gravy-soaked biscuits and chipped bowls is one that lingers decades later. Fast forward to today, and tomato gravy has been revived as a darling of Southern comfort food. It shows up on brunch menus, gussied up with fresh herbs, artisanal biscuits, and sometimes even a poached egg on top. Foodies rave about its rustic charm, often forgetting that it wasn't born out of creativity, but out of necessity. In the farmhouse kitchens of the 1970s, there was no need for reinvention. Tomato gravy over biscuits was survival served with a spoon, a dish that made the most out of what the garden provided and turned humble ingredients into lasting memories. Oatmeal every which way. In the 1970s farmhouse kitchen, oatmeal wasn't a recipe as much as it was a way of life. It was cheap, filling, and endlessly adaptable, which made it the breakfast hero for families who had to stretch every penny. On some mornings, oatmeal was cooked slowly on the stove with milk and sugar until it turned creamy and sweet. On others, it was boiled in nothing but water with a pinch of salt, plain and hearty. Whatever the form, it was always there, waiting to be dressed up with whatever the kitchen had on hand. Raisins, apple butter, a drizzle of honey, or simply eaten plain. If you were lucky, a pat of butter melting into the warm oats felt like luxury. Its beauty lies in its flexibility. For little ones, oatmeal could be made thin and soupy, easy to eat before school. For parents heading out into the cold, it could be cooked thick and hearty, sticking to the ribs and fueling hours of labor. Even leftovers had a second life. Poured into a pan, cooled and sliced, the oatmeal could be fried up the next morning like cornmeal mush, turning yesterday's breakfast into today's. Children may have groaned at its regular appearance on the table, weary of yet another bowl of oats, but parents saw it for what it was: a guarantee that no one would leave the house hungry. Today, oatmeal has been reinvented as overnight oats, layered in mason jars, flavored with almond butter, chia seeds, or exotic fruit toppings. It's photographed and praised as a trendy health food, marketed as something new. But on the 1970s farm, it was never about style. It was just oats, plain, honest, sustaining, and always dependable. A bowl of oatmeal in those days carried no pretense, only the quiet assurance that even in lean times, there would be something warm on the table to start the day. Homemade bread, white or wheat. In the 1970s farmhouse, the smell of homemade bread was as familiar as the crow of the rooster in the yard. Store-bought loaves existed, neatly sliced and wrapped in plastic, but many farm families couldn't justify the expense when flour, yeast, water, and a little time could yield something fresher and far more satisfying. White bread was often the standard, prized for its soft crumb and versatility, while wheat loaves, denser, heartier, and a little chewy, were favored by families who valued nourishment over fluff. The process of mixing, kneading, and waiting for dough to rise was less of a chore and more of a rhythm, woven into the fabric of daily life. Well-worn pans lined kitchen counters, and the sound of crusts cracking as bread cooled became part of the household soundtrack. Bread wasn't just another food item. It was the foundation upon which meals were built. A thick slice with butter could stand alone as breakfast. Paired with a steaming bowl of soup or beans, it became supper. Spread with jam or apple butter, it transforms into dessert. Children often lingered in the kitchen, waiting for the first loaf to cool just enough to tear into, steam rising as butter melted into every crevice. In leaner times, bread stretched meals, making modest servings of meat or vegetables feel like a complete feast. It was the quiet workhorse of the table, dependable and satisfying, carrying with it the scent of warmth and care. Today, baking bread has shifted into something different. For many, it is a hobby, a therapeutic escape, or even an artisanal craft, celebrated in glossy cookbooks and food blogs. The COVID-19 lockdowns revived it for countless households as people sought comfort in the timeless act of kneading dough and waiting for it to rise. But in the 1970s farmhouse, bread was never trendy or optional. It was a necessity. Each loaf symbolized thrift, resilience, and a commitment to feeding the family with what was on hand. Warm, sturdy, and always waiting on the counter, homemade bread was more than food. It was security, tradition, and the comforting heartbeat of farm life. Chicken and dumplings, stretch the bird. On a 1970s farm, one chicken wasn't just a single meal, it was the cornerstone of an entire week's worth of suppers. Families understood the art of stretching every last part of the bird, and chicken and dumplings was the ultimate example of that thrift. A whole chicken might be roasted first, with the prime cuts eaten right away. Then the carcass, bones, and scraps were simmered into a golden broth rich with flavor and memory. Into that bubbling pot went dumplings, made from nothing more than flour, water, and a pinch of baking powder, rolled or dropped in by hand. They puffed up, tender and hearty, turning a humble pot of broth into a feast that could fill every stomach around the table. This dish was equal parts comfort and strategy. The broth carried the essence of the chicken long after most of the meat was gone. While the dumplings stretched the meal into abundance, children eagerly scooped up the fluffy treasures floating in the pot, competing for the biggest dumpling, while parents quietly appreciated the satisfaction of making one bird last for days. It was the kind of meal that warmed the body and the spirit, especially on cold nights when families return from chores needing something both hearty and familiar. Chicken and dumplings was also a dish of ingenuity. It proved that with a little creativity, even modest ingredients could feel plentiful. It carried with it the reassurance that no one would go hungry, that a single chicken could sustain and comfort a household in countless ways. Today, the dish has been elevated into a Southern classic, often served in restaurants dressed with herbs, cream, and gourmet flair. But in the farmhouse kitchens of the 70s, it was simpler and far more essential. It wasn't about indulgence or nostalgia, it was about resourcefulness. Every ladle of broth and every bite of dumpling was proof that nothing went to waste, and that love, when poured into a pot, could be stretched as far as needed. Chicken and dumplings was more than a recipe. It was a lesson in survival, care, and the kind of comfort only born from necessity. Shepherd's pie, ground beef mashed potatoes. In the 1970s farmhouse kitchen, shepherd's pie wasn't about culinary showmanship. It was about survival stitched together with a side of comfort. Ground beef, one of the most affordable cuts of meat, became the cornerstone of this humble dish. Browned with onions, it formed the savory base, and if the garden was generous, it went a handful of peas or carrots for color and sweetness. That mixture was spread into a casserole dish, then blanketed with mashed potatoes, sometimes whipped smooth and creamy with a little milk and butter, other times left rustic and lumpy, showing every ridge of the fork that spread them. Baked until golden on top, the pie emerged as a dish hearty enough to feed a crowd on little more than scraps and starch. For farm families, shepherd's pie meant more than dinner. It was a kind of edible security blanket. Kids eagerly dug their spoons through the crusty potato layer, savoring the hidden pockets of meat and vegetables tucked below, while parents took quiet pride in turning odds and ends into something that felt whole and satisfying. Leftovers were not just tolerated but welcomed. The pie reheated beautifully, often tasting richer the next day when the flavors had more time to meld. It was the kind of dish that worked hard, just like the people who ate it. Fast forward to today, and shepherd's pie has been gentrified in gastropubs and restaurants, dressed up with lamb, artisanal cheeses, and fancy garnishes. But in the 70s farmhouse, there was no pretense. It was no frills nourishment, an edible patchwork quilt that kept families warm and full, proving that humble ingredients, layered with care, could create something that felt like a feast. Shepherd's pie wasn't just food, it was proof that thrift and creativity could transform scraps into comfort night after night. Jell-O salad. No dish screams 1970s farm table kitsch, quite like the Jell-O salad. Bright, wobbly, and sometimes alarmingly inventive. It was the era's way of stretching a cheap box of gelatin into something that looked like dessert, or depending on what went inside, a puzzling side dish. Powdered gelatin was dissolved in boiling water, then filled with add-ins that ranged from the expected, canned fruit, pineapple chunks, mandarin oranges, to the downright questionable like grated carrots, celery, or even cottage cheese. Once poured into decorative molds, it set into a shimmering creation that looked far fancier than the cost of its ingredients suggested. On special occasions, whipped cream, marshmallows, or a cherry on top elevated it into a table centerpiece, quivering proudly under the dining room lights. Children adored the sweetness and the playful jiggle, even if they side-eyed the vegetables suspended inside like fossils trapped in amber. Adults, however, appreciated the thrift behind it. Jell-O salad was cheap, adaptable, and flashy enough to impress at church potlucks, family reunions, or holiday dinners. It proved that frugality didn't always have to look serious. Sometimes it could wobble its way into delight. Each family had its own variation, and recipes were often swapped on note cards or passed down in community cookbooks, adding to the dish's sense of shared tradition. Today, Jell-O salad has taken on new life as a retro novelty, appearing at themed dinners or on ironic Pinterest boards, celebrated with equal parts humor and nostalgia. But in the 1970s farmhouse, there was no irony in its presence. It was sincere, beloved, and memorable, an edible symbol of optimism and resourcefulness in an era when every penny counted. Wobbly, sweet, and sometimes a little strange, Jell-O salad was proof that joy could be found in the most unexpected forms, served one quivering slice at a time. Pickled beets and eggs. In the 1970s farmhouse kitchen, pickled beets and eggs were both thrifty and striking. A dish that managed to be practical while looking almost celebratory. Beets, often pulled straight from the garden and preserved in jars during summer, were sliced and combined with hard-boiled eggs in a vinegar brine. After a few days of soaking, the eggs emerged with vibrant magenta shells and yolks tinged pink, their tangy flavor marrying the earthy sweetness of the beets. It was food that doubled as art, sitting on the table like a splash of color in an otherwise plain meal. For families, this dish carried a sense of continuity and tradition. The brine not only preserved the beets and flavored the eggs, but it also spoke of careful planning, stretching summer's harvest deep into the colder months. Children might have hesitated at the sharp flavor, but they rarely forgot the sight of those jewel-toned eggs in the pickle jar. Today, you'll spot similar jars in artisanal markets, rebranded as gourmet or heritage snacks. But in the 1970s, pickled beets and eggs weren't trendy. They were practical, reliable, and a little splash of cheer served right out of the mason jar. Sloppy Joes. Few meals in the 1970s were as fun or as unapologetically messy as Sloppy Joes. Born out of the need to stretch a pound of ground beef into a family feast, this dish quickly became a staple at farm tables across America. The recipe was straightforward and relied on pantry basics. Brown the ground beef with onions, stir in ketchup or tomato sauce, add a splash of Worcestershire if it was handy, and let it simmer until it thickens into a sweet, savory mixture. Spoon it generously over soft hamburger buns and dinner was served. Cheap, quick, and hearty. The only downside? Napkins and sometimes shirt sleeves didn't stand a chance. For farm kids, Sloppy Joes were a highlight. After days of more modest meals, beans, soups, or simple vegetables, Sloppy Joes felt like a celebration. The tangy sauce dripped down chins and hands as children laughed their way through supper, savoring every bite. Parents, on the other hand, appreciated the dish for more practical reasons. It was budget-friendly, filling, and could be made in a single skillet in under 30 minutes. It was the kind of recipe that worked on busy weeknights after long hours in the fields or barns, requiring little more than a few staple ingredients always on hand. Leftovers were equally valuable. The saucy mixture could be spooned over rice, potatoes, or even tucked into another slice of bread, proving its versatility beyond the bun. Nothing went to waste, and the dish managed to stay exciting even in repeat appearances. Today, Sloppy Joes are often remembered with nostalgia as cafeteria fare, or they're reinvented in food trucks and restaurants as loose meat sandwiches, dressed up with brioche buns and gourmet toppings. But back in the 1970s, there was nothing gourmet about them. They were simply fun, frugal, and filling. An edible reminder that sometimes the best meals are the ones that don't take themselves too seriously. Sloppy Joes weren't refined, but they didn't need to be. They were a working family's comfort food, dripping with flavor and laughter in equal measure. Apple butter on toast. In the 1970s farmhouse kitchen, apple butter on toast was a small but cherished pleasure, the kind of food that carried an entire season's labor in every bite. When autumn came, families gathered apples by the basketful from backyard trees or local orchards. Those apples were cooked down slowly over hours, sometimes even days, with sugar and spices until they became apple butter, a thick, dark spread with a smoky sweetness that went deeper than any jam or jelly. Poured into mason jars and sealed tight, it became a staple that carried the abundance of fall straight into the long, lean months of winter. Unlike ordinary fruit preserves, apple butter had a richness that made even a plain slice of bread feel special. Spread thick over homemade bread fresh from the oven, it could serve as breakfast, a school day snack, or even dessert. For children, apple butter was comfort in edible form, the kind of food that brightened chilly mornings or rewarded them after long days of chores. For parents, it was thrift at its finest, a way to stretch the apple harvest into countless meals and ensure that nothing went to waste. The ritual of making apple butter was often as important as eating it. Whole families sometimes gathered to peel, stir, and simmer, filling the house and yard with the warm scent of spiced apples. It was work, yes, but it was also tradition, an autumn marker as familiar as the changing leaves or the first cold snap. Today, apple butter shows up at farmers' markets, sold in rustic jars with nostalgic labels, often marketed as a specialty item. Foodies celebrate it as old-fashioned and authentic. But in the 1970s farmhouse kitchen, it wasn't a novelty at all. It was a practical staple, born of abundance and necessity, that turned the simplest meal, toast, into something memorable. Apple butter on toast wasn't just food, it was a quiet reminder of resourcefulness, family tradition, and the sweetness of making do with what the land provided. Meatloaf with oats or crackers. In the 1970s farmhouse kitchen, meatloaf wasn't about culinary glory. It was about stretching what little you had into something that could feed a family of 6 without breaking the budget. Ground beef, while cheaper than many cuts, still wasn't something farm families could use freely. That's where the ingenuity of oats or crushed crackers came in. They weren't just filler. They were the secret to making 1 pound of beef seem like 2. Stirred in with chopped onions, an egg or two, and maybe a splash of ketchup or tomato sauce. Those fillers gave the loaf body and texture, helping it hold together as it baked in battered pans that had seen years of use. Loaf that filled the air with savory aromas long before it was pulled from the oven. For families, meatloaf was more than food. It was a ritual. The first night, thick slices were cut and served piping hot, often with mashed potatoes and green beans if the garden was still producing. The next day, those same slices were transformed into sandwiches, tucked between pieces of homemade bread with a swipe of mustard. Leftovers stretched even further, crumbled into soups or stews, ensuring that nothing went to waste. Children's feelings about meatloaf were mixed. Some dreaded its dense consistency, while others relished it as comfort on a plate. Either way, it was a constant presence, anchoring suppers with familiarity and stability. The beauty of meatloaf was its adaptability. Each family had its own twist. Some swore by oats, others swore by crushed saltines, and still others mixed in vegetables like grated carrots to stretch it further. The topping varied too. Ketchup smeared across the top was the classic, caramelizing into a tangy glaze, though some used tomato soup or even brown sugar for sweetness. No two meatloaves were ever quite alike, but the goal was always the same: make a little meat go a long way. Today, meatloaf has made its way back into popularity, often dressed up in diners with fancy sauces or served in gastropubs with grass-fed beef and artisan glazes. Food television celebrates it as retro comfort food, reminding people of its humble roots. But in the 1970s farmhouse kitchen, no one thought of it as nostalgic or chic. It wasn't about presentation or reinvention. It was about necessity. Meatloaf was survival wrapped in ketchup, the proof that thrift and comfort could bake together side by side in a single pan. In its simplicity, it told a story of resourcefulness, resilience, and the determination to keep everyone at the table fed. Potato soup. In the 1970s, potato soup was the kind of meal that came to the rescue when cupboards ran low, but the family still needed something hot and filling at the end of the day. Potatoes were always on hand, whether fresh from the garden or stored in the root cellar, waiting patiently through the winter months. With just a few other staples, an onion, a little milk, maybe a knob of butter, those potatoes could be transformed into a pot of creamy soup that stretched far enough to feed the whole table. On lean nights, the soup might have been nothing more than potatoes, water, and salt. On better nights, a ham bone or a few strips of bacon added richness and depth. Either way, the result was warm, hearty, and dependable. For farm families, potato soup represented resilience in a bowl. It was cheap, easy to prepare, and endlessly adaptable. If carrots or celery were available, they went in. If the cow was still giving plenty of milk, the soup turned creamy and rich. If not, it was thinner but still nourishing. Children often slurped it down with biscuits or homemade bread on the side, soaking up every last drop. Parents, meanwhile, took pride in how far a single sack of potatoes could be stretched, knowing that those humble tubers could carry the family through lean weeks without complaint. The beauty of potato soup was that it worked for every occasion. It could be a quick lunch, a hearty supper, or even a starter for bigger meals if guests happened to stop by. Leftovers reheated well, often thickening overnight into something even more filling. And for families who worked outdoors in the cold, there was no greater comfort than coming into a steaming pot of soup that warmed hands as well as stomachs. Today, potato soup is often reinvented in restaurants and cookbooks, elevated with leeks, sharp cheeses, cream, or even truffle oil. It's celebrated as a comfort food, photographed with garnishes and served in glossy bowls. But in the 1970s farmhouse, it was never about flair. It was about survival and sustenance, about making something from very little and sharing it with everyone at the table. Potato soup was proof that simplicity could be powerful, that thrift could taste like comfort, and that even the most modest ingredients could carry a family through hard times. Warm, plain, and quietly sustaining, it was survival disguised as supper. Zucchini fritters. On 1970s farms, zucchini seemed to multiply overnight, leaving families overwhelmed with more squash than they knew what to do with. Baskets filled porches, counters, and root cellars, and creative cooks had to find ways to keep it from going to waste. Enter zucchini fritters, a dish born of necessity, but remembered for its comfort. Grated zucchini, often salted and drained to remove excess water, was mixed with flour, an egg or two, and a pinch of salt. Sometimes onions or cheese made their way into the mix, but more often it was just the basics. Then, spoonfuls of the batter were fried in a skillet until golden and crisp on the outside, tender and savory on the inside. What began as garden overflow turned into a meal that disappeared as quickly as it hit the table. For farm kids, fritters were a welcome break from endless loaves of zucchini bread or plain steamed squash. The crisp edges made them feel like a treat, even though they were born from practicality. They were best eaten hot from the skillet, sometimes with applesauce or sour cream if the pantry allowed. Parents saw them differently. To them, fritters weren't indulgence, they were resourcefulness in action. Proof that even when the garden overproduced, nothing had to be wasted. Every zucchini that threatened to take over the kitchen could be transformed into something everyone enjoyed. The beauty of zucchini fritters lay in their versatility. They could appear at breakfast alongside eggs, at lunch as a quick bite, or at supper as a side dish that sometimes doubled as the main course. They fried up quickly, which made them perfect for busy farm kitchens where time was scarce and appetites were big. Leftovers were rare, but when they did happen, fritters reheated well or even tasted good cold, tucked into lunch boxes for school or work in the fields. Today, zucchini fritters have made their way into cookbooks, blogs, and health-conscious kitchens. They're often rebranded as gluten-free appetizers, paired with yogurt dips, or styled with herbs for food photography. But in the 1970s farmhouse, they weren't trendy or Instagram-worthy. They were practical, born from an overzealous garden and the determination not to waste food. Every crispy bite carried the wisdom of frugality, the ingenuity of making do, and the simple pleasure of eating vegetables fried into comfort. Zucchini fritters were proof that even surplus could taste like abundance, so long as you had a hot skillet, a little patience, and a hungry family waiting at the table. Bologna sandwiches. In the 1970s, a bologna sandwich was the kind of meal that showed up in lunch pails, on school trays, and at farmhouse tables when money was tight and options were few. Bologna was cheap, processed, and dependable, stacked in round slices that fried up crisp or stayed cold between two slices of white bread. Add a smear of mustard or mayo, maybe a slice of cheese if the budget stretched, and you had a sandwich that was quick, filling, and familiar. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, the sort of food that kept you going through chores or long days in the field. For kids, bologna sandwiches were a mixed bag. Some loved the salty, tangy bite, while others grew tired of its near-daily appearance. Parents, however, leaned on it as a reliable standby, something that could be thrown together in minutes and eaten without fuss. Today, the same sandwich has been rebranded in delis and food trucks, dressed up as artisan mortadella with pickles, fancy mustards, and rustic breads. But in the farmhouse kitchens of the 70s, it was nothing more than survival between two slices, humble proof that simple food could carry families through lean times. Rice and beans. For farm families in the 1970s, rice and beans were the definition of dependable, low-cost nourishment. A sack of rice and a bag of dried beans could last weeks, providing steady meals that didn't put pressure on the family budget. Pinto beans, black beans, or navy beans, whatever variety was available, were soaked overnight and simmered until tender. They were then spooned over fluffy rice, creating a dish that was hearty, satisfying, and endlessly repeatable. Some cooks added onions, garlic, or a ham hock to the pot if they were available, But even without extras, rice and beans stood on their own as a complete meal. Most families didn't think in terms of complete proteins, as nutritionists might describe today. They simply knew it filled bellies and fueled long days of labor. Children sometimes groaned at its repetition, but its constancy was also comforting. When times were lean, rice and beans were a guarantee, always waiting in the pantry to be transformed into supper. Parents leaned heavily on it as the ultimate survival staple. It could be eaten for breakfast with an egg, for lunch with tortillas or bread, and for supper as a hearty stew. It wasn't a dish that required creativity. It was one that rewarded consistency, and that made it invaluable. The adaptability of rice and beans also made it a communal dish. Different families had their own versions. Some spiced it heavily, others kept it plain. In Mexican-American and Southern farming communities, it became a cultural cornerstone, bringing people together over bowls of food that reflected both necessity and tradition. Leftovers were not a burden, but a blessing, reheated and enjoyed across multiple meals. Fast forward to today, and rice and beans have been rebranded as health food, celebrated by dietitians for their protein-packed simplicity, and embraced by meal preppers for their affordability and ease. They are praised in cookbooks as examples of clean eating, and chefs reimagine them with exotic spices and toppings. But in the 1970s farmhouse kitchen, rice and beans weren't trendy or stylish. They were survival food, eaten without fuss or fanfare. Simple, sustaining, and dependable, they were proof that some of the humblest pairings can carry a family through even the hardest seasons. Cabbage rolls. In the 1970s farmhouse kitchen, cabbage rolls represented the meeting of thrift and tradition, especially in communities shaped by immigrant roots. A single head of cabbage, cheap and plentiful, could be transformed into a dozen hearty bundles, each leaf carefully filled with a mixture of rice, onions, and just enough ground meat to lend flavor. Rolled tightly and simmered in tomato sauce, or baked together in a casserole dish, they emerged tender, savory, and deeply satisfying. This was a dish that stretched a little protein into something that felt abundant, proof of how far resourcefulness could go in the hands of a clever cook. For many families, cabbage rolls carried more than flavor, they carried heritage. Recipes were passed down from grandmothers, often handwritten on recipe cards stained from years of use, adjusted according to what was available in the pantry. Some families favored more rice, others leaned on a tomato-rich sauce, and still others added spices that reflected their cultural backgrounds. The smell of cabbage rolls baking filled the house with an aroma that was both divisive and memorable. Children might wrinkle their noses at the strong cabbage scent, but as adults, they often remembered it as the fragrance of home and family. The beauty of cabbage rolls was their practicality. They could be made in large batches, ensuring there was always enough to feed unexpected guests or to stretch across multiple meals. Leftovers reheated beautifully, often tasting richer the next day as the flavors deepened in the sauce. For busy farm families, that made them an efficient, reliable dish, one that rewarded the time invested in rolling and simmering. Today, cabbage rolls have become part of what's known as heritage cuisine. They appear proudly at cultural festivals, church potlucks, and in cookbooks that celebrate old world traditions. Food enthusiasts regard them as comfort food with a story, a connection to ancestry and identity. But in the 1970s farmhouse kitchen, they weren't served for nostalgia or cultural pride. They were served because they were smart cooking. They embodied the art of stretching food, of preserving and savoring every scrap the earth provided. Cabbage rolls stood as more than just sustenance, they were a reflection of resilience and continuity. They told the story of families who made the most of what they had, who carried traditions across generations, and who found ways to feed both body and soul and spirit with a single humble dish: scrambled eggs with whatever's left. On a 1970s farm, scrambled eggs were never just scrambled eggs. They were a canvas for whatever odds and ends lingered in the kitchen. A few leftover potatoes, last night's vegetables, a crumble of bacon, or even scraps of cheese if the budget allowed, all found their way into the skillet. Eggs were plentiful on most farms, so they became the reliable base, fluffy and golden, binding together whatever ingredients were in danger of going to waste. It was the original clean out the fridge meal long before that became a Pinterest trend. For children, the surprise factor made it fun. Sometimes breakfast, sometimes supper, always different. For parents, it was the satisfaction of knowing nothing went unused. Proof of resourcefulness and resilience in every forkful. The dish was quick, comforting, and endlessly flexible, which made it a staple when time was short and appetites were long. Today, the same approach shows up in brunch menus as scrambles or egg skillets, often priced like luxuries. But in the farmhouse kitchens of the 70s, it was about survival and thrift. A skillet of scrambled eggs with whatever's left was a reminder that even the humblest scraps could add up to something satisfying. Molasses cookies, or cake. In the 1970s farmhouse kitchen, molasses cookies or cake were the sweet reward born from thrift. White sugar was sometimes a splurge, but molasses, thick, dark, and inexpensive, was always around, often bought in bulk or kept on hand from earlier canning seasons. Mixed with flour, eggs, and spices, it baked into chewy cookies or dense, moist cake that carried a deep, almost smoky sweetness. The flavor was bold, comforting, and unmistakably old-fashioned, the kind of taste that clung to memory long after the last crumb was gone. For families, molasses treats weren't just dessert. They were a reminder of simpler celebrations. A plate of cookies might appear after Sunday supper, or a cake might be baked for a birthday when store-bought sweets were out of reach. Children loved the richness, often dunking cookies into milk, while parents appreciated how far a single jar of molasses could stretch. Today, recipes for molasses cookies and cakes resurface around the holidays, dressed up with frosting or gingerbread spices. But in the farmhouse kitchens of the 70s, they weren't seasonal novelties. They were everyday proof that even the humblest pantry staple could sweeten life, one sticky bite at a time. That's our journey through 30 cheap dishes poor farmers ate in the 1970s. Meals born from thrift, hard work, and a little kitchen ingenuity. Some of them you might remember from your own family table, others might surprise you, but all of them carry the same spirit of resilience. If you enjoyed this trip down memory lane, give the video a like, share it with someone who loves a bit of food nostalgia, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories from the past brought to life.